Hello chess fans, this is Rick from Chess to Impress with the next video in the countdown towards the resumption of the 2020 Candidates Tournament, which was cut short in March because of the corona pandemic. On Chess to Impress we're counting down towards the resumption of that great event by looking at the 29 earlier candidate cycles in the history of the World Championship. This is episode number 13. Let me give you a brief overview of these 29 cycles. You can also fast forward to the game, which I'll show in this video. The timestamp is here. It all started in London 1883, where Zukertort and Steinitz occupied the first two places. They played the first official World Championship match 3 years later. Steinitz gained a rematch against world champion Emanuel Lasker in the St. Petersburg tournament 1895-1896, and Paul Keres from Estonia won the tournament in the Netherlands in 1938 to gain the right to challenge world champion Aljechin for a match. That match never happened because of World War II. The first official candidates tournament was held in Budapest and Moscow in 1950. David Bronstein was the winner and gained the right to challenge Mikhail Botvinnik for the world title. Vasily Smyslov won two candidate cycles in 1953 and 1956, and Misha Tal was Botvinnik's next challenger. Petrosyan won the candidates tournament in Curaçao. He dethroned Botvinnik the year after. Boris Spassky won two candidate cycles, which then had turned into candidate matches in 1965 and 1968, and Bobby Fischer beat Tigran Petrosyan in Buenos Aires 1971 to become Spassky's challenger. Anatoly Karpov beat Viktor Korchnoi in Moscow 1974 to qualify for a match against world champion Bobby Fischer. That match unfortunately never happened and Karpov became world champion by default. Korchnoi won the next two cycles. The first one is there in red because I will tell you a bit more about that cycle, and we're going to look at a game from Korchnoi played in that candidate cycle. Garry Kasparov came on the scene in 1984 and became world champion the year after. Karpov won the next two cycles for more matches against Kasparov, and in 1993 Nigel Short beat Jan Timman in San Lorenzo de El Escorial, and it was his turn to play Kasparov. Anand was Kasparov's next challenger, and it should have been Alexei Shirov who beat Kramnik in Katsorla in 1998, but he never got a match. Kramnik did and became world champion in the year 2000. Peter Leko was Kramnik's first challenger, and in 2007 we had a World Championship tournament which was won by Anand. 4 players qualified for the tournament: Aranyan, Gelfand, Grishuk and Leko. Anand's next 3 challengers were Topalov, Gelfand and Carlsen. Carlsen beat Anand, who came back by winning the next cycle for a rematch against Carlsen. Carlsen won again and then defended his title successfully against Karyakin and Karana in the next cycles. So who will it be? It will all start again on Sunday, November 1st in Yekaterinburg in Russia, and the winner will gain the right to challenge world champion Magnus Carlsen for the world title. As said, we're going to look at the candidate cycle from 1976 and 1978. There were 2 interzonals. The first one was held in Manila on the Philippines, and the 3 top players there in green qualified for the candidates matches. Enrique Macking from Brazil, Lev Polugajevsky from the Soviet Union and Vlastimil Hort from Czechoslovakia. The other interzonal was held in Biel, and Larsen, Petrosyan and Portisch qualified. The last 2 after a playoff, which included Misha Tal, who finished in 4th place and just missed out. The candidate matches were held in 1977, and as the loser of the last championship and runner-up of the previous candidate cycle, Bobby Fischer was seeded directly into the candidates, but not surprisingly, he declined. Spassky, as losing semi-finalist of the previous candidates tournament, was offered a spot. And as runner-up of the previous candidates tournament, Viktor Korchnoi was also seeded directly into the candidates matches. By that time he was stateless, having fled the Soviet Union and played under the FIDE flag. This is the bracket of the candidates matches. Korchnoi beat Petrosyan, Polugajevsky beat Macking, Spassky beat Hort and Portisch beat Larsen. In the semi-finals, Korchnoi easily overcame Polugajevsky and Spassky beat Portisch. In the final, Korchnoi beat Spassky by a 3-point margin, and he was world champion Anatoly Karpov's first official challenger. That match was held in Baguio City on the Philippines and was narrowly won by Karpov 6-5. I did a series on all the World Championship matches, I'll put a link up here, but in this series we're focusing on the candidate cycles. And this is a picture from the candidates final, Spassky on the left, Korchnoi on the right. It was played in Belgrade in former Yugoslavia. In this video we're going to look at Game 2 from the candidates final. The first game had ended in a draw. Korchnoi missed a win in time trouble. In Game 2, Spassky had the white pieces and he opened with the e-pawn. Victor Korchnoi played the French defense. And we will see one of the main lines of this opening being played. Let's put the opening moves on the board and go to move 13, where Kasparov in his book My Great Predecessors is making his first real comment. I'm using Kasparov's annotations for this video. d4, d5, knight c3, bishop b4, e5, c5, a3 kicking the bishop, bishop takes, b takes, knight e7 and queen g4. This is a very sharp line. In subsequent games, Spassky chose knight f3. Kasparov writes, the effect of this game 2 was so strong that in the next 4 even-numbered games with the French defense, Spassky avoided the sharp 7 queen g4 variation and played the positional line with knight f3. But queen g4 was played in this game. C takes, queen takes g7, rook g8 and queen takes h7. White wins a pawn, but his queen is lost in black's position. Queen c7, knight e2, knight b to c6, f4, bishop d7, all theory, queen d3, back into its own camp, d takes c3 and bishop e3. And Kasparov writes here that this is a rare and unpromising reply. White does better to first eliminate the c3 pawn with knight takes c3. So bishop e3 is a rare move. d4 from Korchnoi. And Kasparov says this is a novelty and a typical pawn sacrifice. Energetic play from Korchnoi. Spassky did not take on d4, he played bishop f2, and Kasparov writes this appears to lose a tempo, but Spassky wants to capture on d4 only after black has castled queenside in order to attack the pawn on a7. This is real grandmaster play, playing bishop f2 first. Korchnoi indeed castled queenside, and only now did Spassky take on d4. Knight takes, queen takes, indeed, attacking the pawn on a7, which is now unprotected, so b6. And Kasparov writes that from here, Korchnoi retains enduring positional compensation for the pawn he is down, thanks to the chronic weakness of the white king, which is stuck in the center. Bishop h4 from Spassky. Bishop b5, and Spassky played his queen to e4. Bishop c6 is the alternative for the move played in the game, as pointed out by Kasparov, but Korchnoi took on f1, took the bishop. Spassky took back with the rook, and Kasparov writes, white maintains the balance and hopes to gradually repel the attack, hide his king behind his kingside pawns, and then in the endgame advance his h-pawn with decisive effect. But as said a long time ago by Siegbert Tarrasch, before the endgame, the gods have created the middle game. And Korchnoi correctly judged that with the queens on the board, black's threats to the king are quite serious. So if white gets to an endgame, he'll have the better position with his passed h-pawn and his extra pawn. But first we have the middle game. Rook d5 played by Korchnoi. Spassky took on e7, queen takes, and rook f3. Attacking the c3 pawn. King b8, inviting white to treat himself to another pawn, says Grandmaster Kuzmin. Heavy piece endings are sometimes called the fourth stage of the game. And we have here a brilliant illustration on the theme of a combined attack. As we'll see, black will combine attacks against the c-pawn with attack against white's exposed king. After king b8, Spassky played king f1, and Kasparov calls this a serious inaccuracy, and he says that g3 should have been played here. If you then play rook d2, then there is rook takes c3. This is good for white. What happens if you take on c3 straight away? That is a blunder because of queen h4 check, explains Kasparov. king f1 and rook d2 with a very, very strong attack on white's king. So king f1 was played, but Kasparov does not like this move. Rook d2, and Kasparov says this invasion, creating threats both to the king and the c2 pawn, forces the exchange of one pair of rooks and enables black to develop a dangerous initiative. g3 is not a good move here because of queen c5, shows Kasparov. So Spassky played rook f2 instead. Rook g to d8, and if you now take on d2, then either c takes d2 or rook takes d2 is good for black. In the game, Spassky played queen f3. There goes a pair of rooks off the board. The second rook comes to d2 with check. If you go to f1, then queen c5 is strong again, shows Kasparov. In the game, Spassky went to g3 with the king. If you now take on c2, then there is rook d1 with counterplay. And that's why Korchnoi played another move. He did not take the pawn, he played queen d8, which Kasparov calls an excellent move, putting the queen on a different track, forcing the opponent to solve new problems. Queen e4, yes, we have to protect the c-pawn. Queen g8 check, king h3, queen h8 check, king g3, and queen g7 check. King h3 and now rook d8, provoking another weakening pawn move, explains Kasparov. The threat is obvious. Rook h8 would be devastating. It would be checkmate on the next move. Kasparov shows that g3 here is not good because of queen h8 check. And if you go to g2, then rook d2 check leads to a quick checkmate. And if you go to g4 in this position, then there is rook g8 check, king f3, and queen takes h2, and black is winning. So after rook d8, you cannot play g3, and that's why Spassky played g4 instead, and hopes to hide with his king behind his pawns. But as said, it's another weakening move. The pawn on g4 is weaker than it was on g2. Korchnoi played rook h8 check, king g3, and queen h6. With an attack on the h2 pawn, so queen g2 was played, and Kasparov writes, black's attack along the h-file forces white to move his queen from the center. For the moment, he is unable to consolidate his forces, bring his inactive rook into the game, or at least threaten a perpetual check with his queen. That rook on a1 is just looking at everything from afar, is not taking part in the game at all. Korchnoi gave another check, king f3, and the rook swings back to d8. The culminating point of this very complicated and tense game. The issue is decided in a time scramble, literally within the course of 2 moves, writes Kasparov. And he points out that here rook f1 should have been played by Spassky. By urgently activating his rook, white would have held the position. All the white pieces are now in play. And that makes sense. All pieces want to be at the party. And of course Spassky knows that, but he played queen g3 here. And that move gets a question mark from Kasparov. Queen e7, which is an error in reply, which makes the win very difficult, says Kasparov. And he explains that queen h7 should have been played, attacking the c2 pawn. That is the best move. But in time scramble, anything can happen. Queen e7 was played, and now g5, and that is what Kasparov calls the fatal mistake. Spassky is attempting to create a loophole for his king, but he misses the last chance to solve the problem of his rook on a1. And Kasparov says rook e1 should have been played here to finally bring that rook into the game. But g5 was played, rook d2, and Kasparov says that now black is winning. King g4 and queen b7, another beautiful queen move. It has the idea of queen e4 to pick up the pawn on c2, after which the pawn on c3 becomes a monster. Black is also threatening rook g2, protected by the queen, and winning white's queen. So it's time for Spassky to take off that potentially very dangerous pawn on c3, rook g2 check, king h3, and rook f2. threatening queen g2 with a quick checkmate. Let's see how that checkmate works. Let's make a very silly move for white just to show the checkmate. If you play something like a4, then there is queen g2 check and mate in a few moves. If you want to look for yourself, how does a white king get checkmated in a few moves here, then you can put the video on pause. King h4 only move, rook takes f4 check is the quickest way. King h5 only move, queen takes h2 check. You can only interpose your own queen, and this is checkmate. So that is the threat after rook f2. Spassky played king g4 to deal with that threat, but resigned after queen e4 was played on the 40th move. The time control was made, and Spassky saw that he's losing heavy material here. Black is threatening to take on f4 with a quick checkmate, and there's only one way to protect f4, and that is queen g3, but then there is rook g2, and that wins the queen. And the queen's rook is still on a1. Even former world champions sometimes commit a crime of not putting all their pieces into play. As I showed you, Korchnoi went on to win the match by a 3-point margin, and he qualified to play world champion Anatoly Karpov for the world title. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, that you give it a thumbs up, that you'll subscribe to the Chess to Impress channel, and that you'll leave a comment. I will read them all and I will reply to them all. If you like the video, if you like this series, it would be great if you could share it on social media by clicking the share button on YouTube. You can find me on Instagram, on Twitter and on Facebook. This is Rick for Chess to Impress. Thank you for watching.